This is the CBS Sunday Night News with Ed Bradley.
Good evening. Congressman Leo Ryan of California is dead, shot along with 4 other Americans, including 2 newsmen from NBC. They were gunned down at an airstrip near the remote outpost of Jonestown in Guyana. Ryan had gone there to investigate a camp operated by members of an obscure American religious sect called the People's Temple. After escaping a knife attempt on his life, Ryan and his party were trying to leave last night when the attack occurred. 10 people were wounded in the shooting. We have a report from Bernard Goldberg in Georgetown.
A U.S. medevac plane departed Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, today, carrying those seriously wounded in the ambush shooting. U.S. officials say the dead will remain in Guyana at least until tomorrow. One of the survivors, Bob Flick, an NBC News producer, said the gunman began shooting just moments before 2 planes were to depart from a remote airstrip near the People's Church commune. The planes were to carry the U.S. party of Congressman Ryan and some defectors from the church. Flick told reporters today that when the wounded fell to the ground, the gunman walked over to them, stood over them, and shot them in the head one by one. He said the shootings lasted about 10 minutes and that all the gunmen were Americans. All, he said, appeared to be church members. Another witness indicated they appeared to be shooting only Americans. Flick also said he did not know why they were not all killed or why the attackers waited until they got to the airstrip. There was ample opportunity to kill the U.S. party within the church earlier. And why this happened at all is still not known for certain. Why, if the church leaders feared defections, would they allow Congressman Ryan and members of the press to visit the church in the first place? Tonight, the investigation continues. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Georgetown, Guyana.
The most seriously wounded were taken to a military hospital in Puerto Rico. The others arrived tonight at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington and were taken to the base hospital. 2 people were carried out on stretchers: Steve Sung, a sound man for NBC, and Jacqueline Spire, who served as a legislative aide to the congressman.
The People's Temple in California once claimed a membership of 20,000, most of them black. It is a religion that promotes self-help and community service. It has sponsored a free lunch program here that draws more people than a city-run operation of the same kind. Head of the People's Temple is Jim Jones, who for a time was chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority. But 18 months ago, he and more than 1,000 followers moved to Guyana, intending, he said, to build a 27,000-acre agricultural cooperative. He left under a cloud while the district attorney was conducting an investigation based on allegations by former church members that Jones and his associates had terrorized them, striking and beating them. At the People's Temple headquarters today, the doors were locked and the windows barred. A temple spokesman finally appeared, condemning the murders.
We are nonviolent people. Reverend Jim Jones has always deplored violence, and whatever the circumstances of the airstrip incident, it is not the kind of action anyone within the temple would ever precipitate.
In nearby Berkeley, an organization called the Human Freedom Center, composed mainly of disenchanted followers of the People's Temple, received a phone call from Guyana announcing the safety of a relative who had been at the airport when the killings took place. At the People's Temple, a spokesman said no communications had been received from South America since the attack, but told reporters the church had every intention of staying there no matter what happened. Harold Dow, CBS News, San Francisco.
She's an evil chick. Say she's the witch. She got a long black hair and a big black car. I know what you're thinking, but you won't get far. She's gonna make you ill, 'cause she's the witch. Well, she runs around late at night, most of the people sleeping tight. If you hear a knocking on your door, you better sing it on me. Wow, wow, baby, wow. even tired. If you're knocking on your door, you better take it away. What is of you in? Say, don't you know? And do you remember that I told you so? Gonna do you in, 'cause she's no witch.
State Department spokesman Tom Reston said that as early as last January, department officials had reports that some members of the People's Temple community in Guyana, American officials in Guyana who periodically visited the commune, could find no member of the sect who complained of being there against his or her will. Ryan's chief aide said the department did not alert the congressman to possible violence from the religious group. Reston said that while the department did not discourage Ryan from making the trip, it did express concern.
I will say that the State Department urged caution upon Congressman Ryan, and we did, in a logistical sense, indicate to him the logistical difficulties of taking a large entourage of people into so remote an area of Guyana. So we made him aware of lack of fuel supplies, lack of vehicles, difficulty of communication, that sort of thing.
Reston listed American concerns at this point as making sure that the government of Guyana protects Americans who may still be in the remote jungle area, and ensuring, in his words, that the perpetrators of this outrage be brought to justice as soon as possible. Lem Tucker, CBS News, Washington.
There have been persistent reports today that the followers of the People's Temple have a mass suicide pact and that 200 or 300 of them may have already killed themselves. So far, those reports are unconfirmed. It was word of such bizarre pacts, among other things, that led Congressman Ryan to Guyana and to his death. Diane Sawyer reports.
When Leo Ryan wanted to know about education problems in the Watts Ghetto, he taught high school there. To investigate the California penitentiary system, he spent 6 days in Folsom Prison. When he was elected to Congress 6 years ago, he immersed himself in international affairs and problems of the environment. Today, President Carter said it was Ryan's drive to get his information firsthand that led to his tragic death. Ryan's administrative assistant, Joe Holsinger, said the congressman had been investigating complaints by constituents about the Guyana camp for a year. Holsinger had been worried about the trip.
I didn't ask him not to go, no. I warned him of the dangers and asked him to consider not going. With Leo, you never told Leo what to do.
Members of Ryan's family gathered together, some on the West Coast, some in Washington. His daughter Erin, a Georgetown University student, and her brother Christopher, a marine biologist in Boston, came to Ryan's house near the Capitol. There, Ryan's mother told how she learned her son had died.
And it wasn't until the State Department called this morning about daybreak and said that the death had been confirmed.
Diane Sawyer, CBS News, Washington.
Good evening. The bodies of as many as 400 persons, all of them believed American members of a fanatic religious cult, were found today in a remote jungle compound in Guyana. Most of the dead apparently committed suicide by poison, but possibly a fourth of them were murdered. The bodies were discovered by Guyanan troops after some members of the religious cult, the People's Temple, Saturday night attacked a nearby airstrip and killed 5 persons, among them Congressman Leo Ryan of California and 3 American newsmen. They were there investigating the cult run by American Jim Jones. Jones' body, as well as those of his wife and small son, were reported among the dead found at the village, Jonestown. One of those wounded at the Guyanan landing strip was NBC News soundman Stephen Sung, who last night was flown to Andrews Air Force Base for medical treatment. He's listed in satisfactory condition. Today he held a news conference and recounted the story of what had happened.
Everybody hit the deck, and the congressman and Don Harris, our correspondent, tried to run underneath the big wheel on the other side of the plane. Our camera's still on, meanwhile. The camera's on the floor, still taking pictures. They're shooting at us. Bob Brown, this cameraman. He hit the deck instantly, right? So I hit right next to him, practically like 2 feet away from him, because it's a mini cam, it's a cable connecting to each other. We can't be separated. I lie face down. I have my arm over my head, basically, as though you go to sleep with a baby, you know. One arm, my right arm was on my head like this, my left hand was this, and my face is pushed against, kissing the floor as close as possible. I don't want to move because I know they keep shooting. And next thing I heard, they walking towards us, one of the men. And somehow, one shot hit Bob Brown in the leg, I believe. I don't know what part of the body. He screamed, ouch! And next thing I know, the guy came close and blew his brain off. And next thing I know, I say, oh, next one would be me who get killed, right? So I just didn't think about it. I just think about my little daughter. The next thing I know, I have tremendous pressure, explosion right next to my head, and my arm just feel like falling apart. But I won't dare to move one single muscle. That saved my life. I guess the real saved my life is because my arms is ahead of my head. So the bullet missed the brain and hit my arm instead, and I didn't move, and the blood is all over the place. So they thought I probably dead. That really saved my life. So what I did is I lay still. And meanwhile, I still can hear the gunshot, bang, 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 all over the place. I just won't dare, I just shake like crazy on the ground. Meanwhile, the engine of the plane, the other, still running. So I don't know what's happened because I won't dare to pick up my head because I know if I move anything, they will shoot me instantly. So because I can't hear the tractors moving, all I know the tractor was driving around us. Meanwhile, all around the plane and shooting at the same time. I was sitting there for I thought the eternity must be at least half an hour. Then I heard some woman crying and screaming, so I didn't get up. The first thing I saw is my partner, his brains all over his camera. He's lying dead. Then I don't know what to do. I thought I should get on the plane because the engine's still running, right? Because I thought the only way to get out was to get on the plane. I guess the whole bunch of Guyanese people from the village was walking around, trying to tell me, go up the plane. Somebody told me, run in the jungle. I don't know who to believe. I was going on my way going to the plane, and I decided this was the wrong thing to do. So I rushed towards the jungle, you know. But meanwhile, my arm was bleeding like crazy. I didn't feel the pain, I just feel scared.
Good evening. U.S. troops are in Guyana now, beginning that gruesome task of removing the bodies of 409 Americans, suicide and murder victims of a fanatic religious cult. Hundreds of other members of the People's Temple who fled into the dense, snake-infested rainforest surrounding their commune were beginning to reemerge today, and others are being sought. The scene at Jonestown assaults the senses, almost defies description. Here's David Dick.
The bodies still lie where they fell, face down, the stench almost unbearable. Most seemed to accept death as if they were simply going to sleep. Some had pillows beneath their heads. Some died alone, separated by only a little space. Others held on to their families until the end. It's believed each lived about 5 minutes after swallowing a mixture of cyanide and a flavoring liquid. Babies were fed the lethal potion with a squirt gun. Those who did not drink the poison gave themselves injections. For most, there may have been a quick convulsion, a tightening of the chest, then death. A vat of the poison remained. It is reported at least $1 million in cash was discovered on the premises. Jewelry, Social Security checks. A trunk was filled with 800 passports. Most were U.S. It's surmised the passports had been kept locked up by the temple leaders to make it difficult for anyone to leave the country alive. Hundreds of survivors who fled into the densely forested area have begun to come out again. A preliminary autopsy was said to have been performed today on the body of the founder of the People's Temple, Jim Jones. His son, Stephen Jones, may owe his life to the fact he had left the settlement to play a basketball game. At a news conference, the son denounced his father.
Only that I hope that it just doesn't discredit what I've lived for and what most of the people, at one time, all of the people have lived for. And, you know, that's why I can almost say that I hate this man for doing what he's done because he has destroyed everything I've lived for.
Stephen's mother also died.
All I can say is I'm deeply grieved over her and not so much over my father.
Paula Adams, described as an exile from the settlement, said she had been forced to leave her child at Jonestown.
Child now. We don't know anything.
About 50 members of the religious cult have been taken into protective custody by the Guyana police. Another arrest was made today of a member of the People's Temple, the man identified only as Tim Carter, the specific charges not immediately announced. Soon these transport planes will be taking back the bodies of the United States citizens who left their homeland looking for a new life, but finding instead death. David Dick, CBS News, Georgetown, Guyana.
In Washington, the State Department said Guyana had asked the United States to remove the bodies from Jonestown and take them out of the South American country rather than have them buried there. At Jonestown, while all this was going on, were Americans Mark Lane and Charles Gary, lawyers for Jones and his People's Temple. Jones' people held them under armed guard during and after the ambush massacre at the Jungle Landing Strip, and they were witnesses to the suicide decision. Lane talked about this late yesterday at a news conference in the Guyanan capital of Georgetown.
We were listening to the loudspeaker. We were the furthest house from the auditorium, yet we could hear some words. And I heard Jim Jones say, "Let's not fight among ourselves. Let's not fight among ourselves." He made statements of that kind. Other people talked about the beauty of dying, how this is a great part of our struggle, the dignity of death, etc. And then two young black men came back with semi-automatic weapons, and then they came toward us. And they were pointing the weapons generally in our direction. I knew these two men. I talked about the murder of Dr. King, my last visit, and had many conferences with one of them afterwards. And he told me that we are all going to die. It's a great thing to die in dignity, to die for what you believe in. And this is the great way to struggle. And I said, that's no way to struggle, and there's no dignity in death in taking your own life. And I don't know what you're struggling against anyway. It does not make any sense. But they were smiling. They were not being sarcastic. They were smiling, and they seemed relaxed and happy. And I wondered if they had been doped in some fashion, because they certainly were very relaxed when they were talking and smiling when talking about a very grim matter. They kept on saying, we are all going to die. One of the matters that concerned me was whether I was included in the we, whether Charles Gary was included in the we. And instead of just asking that, after I tried to persuade them not to participate, I said, well, at least Charles and I will be here to tell the story of what happened here. And he stopped for a moment. And he said, that's right. And he said goodbye, and he came over and he hugged me. The other man came over and hugged me. They started to leave, and they hugged Charles. They started to leave, and I said, before you leave, how do we get out of here? And he said, well, when it's all over, you can get a plane out. I said, I don't know when it will be all over. I don't have a plane. How do I walk out of here? And he said, over the hill. Go over that hill through the bush, and you'll finally hit the road. And we started to go very, very quickly. And then, by then, they had enough time to just about reach the auditorium at that time. And then we heard some more talk about the beauty of dying on the loudspeaker, but it was getting very, very faint. We were moving away from it. And then I heard Jim Jones say, mother, 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 mother. And then there was silence, and then I heard automatic rifle fire.
The mass suicides at Jonestown attest to the loyalty of the religious cult's followers, but the People's Temple has among its critics persons with first-hand knowledge, members who defected. Harold Dow in Berkeley, California, talked with some of them.
At a center for former followers of the People's Temple cult today, there was fear and apprehension. Fear that relatives of the people gathered here are among the dead at Jonestown. Apprehension that assassins from the cult might try to kill defectors. Mickey Touche had gone to Guyana, worried about 9 relatives in the camp. U.S. officials there, she said, were not much help.
When we were in Georgetown, we went to the American Embassy and spoke to the ambassador there, Mr. Burke. We told him, look, Jim Jones has been threatening mass suicide. He's been threatening murders for years. We want to go get our people. We want to go talk to them. Now, will you get us in there? He says, I can't get you in there because of the Privacy Act. I can't get you in there because it's private property. But he's been threatening suicide, we said. He was going to give people poison and kill them. The ambassador said, I'm sorry, my hands are tied.
And Jim Cobb, who escaped the massacre at the airstrip, has 5 relatives at Jonestown. If they are dead, he and his sister don't want them buried there.
Well, I prefer the relatives get a chance to bury their own, the people that are dead there. So I think they should make some type of an effort to get the bodies back. And I know one of the mothers here found out that her son is actually dead today, and she wants him to come. She wants him to come back so she can bury him.
The defectors said that cult leader Jim Jones often used doubles, men made up to look like him. All agreed they would believe he was dead only when they saw the body. Harold Dow, CBS News, Berkeley.
It was a sad 19-hour shuttle that an Air Force cargo plane made today, bringing home from Guyana the bodies of the 4 Americans killed Saturday night. David Dow reports.
It was before dawn when the body of NBC News correspondent Don Harris arrived in his native state of Georgia. His funeral to be held there tomorrow. From Georgia, the Air Force plane flew to San Francisco, arriving this morning to bring home the body of Congressman Leo Ryan. Just 8 days ago, Ryan and his party had left here to investigate reports that something was horribly wrong at the People's Temple camp in Guyana. In 22 years in politics, he had often sought information firsthand in ghettos and prison. Family members awaited the casket with congressional aides and friends. Other members of the family and a delegation from Congress will arrive from Washington tomorrow for funeral services in South San Francisco, where Ryan began his political career as a city councilman and mayor. The final stop for the plane, Los Angeles, home of 2 other victims of Saturday's airfield ambush. Greg Robinson, 27-year-old photographer for the San Francisco Examiner, and NBC cameraman Bob Brown. Brown's wife, Connie. An instant before his own death, Brown had shot the only pictures of the ambush. In Congressman Ryan's district today, a further reminder of a tragic week. The flags at half-staff in front of public buildings. David Dow, CBS News, Burlingame,
Good evening.
California.
The story out of Guyana is like a nightmare that just won't quit. Police in the capital of Georgetown have formally charged a 32-year-old Californian with the ambush killings of 5 Americans last Saturday night, the killings that triggered the mass suicides and possibly murders of more than 400 religious zealots in Jonestown. Larry Layton, a top aide to religious cult leader Jim Jones, is being held without bail for a hearing January 15th. 2 other American members of the cult also were arrested, but they've not yet been charged. Possibly as many as 500 other members of the cult fled from the jungle compound while a poison-spiked drink was being administered. They chose as their refuge, though, some of the world's densest and deadliest jungle, infested with poisonous viper snakes, man-eating piranha fish, malarial mosquitoes, and quicksand. U.S. Army helicopters in Guyana to help remove the dead tried to locate the living, blaring loudspeaker messages into the jungle that it is safe to come out. So far, only 72 survivors of the People's Temple cult have turned up. Throughout all this, Army personnel went into Jonestown to survey and try to clean up the disaster. John Sheehan reports.
More than 400 bodies still lie where they fell during the apparent mass suicide and murder. The dead are now grotesquely bloated and discolored, a jumble of corpses and bright clothing scattered around the assembly hall. An American pathologist who examined the bodies said it would have taken about 5 minutes for the potassium cyanide mixture to cause death, suggesting that those still waiting in line saw that people were actually dying, that it was not one of the commune's periodic mock suicide rituals. That apparently is when the survivors ran away, possibly pursued by Jones's gunmen. The number of missing escapees is variously estimated at between 300 and 500, and it is completely conceivable that hundreds of people relatively familiar with the wilderness could subsist in the dense forest, especially with the help of friendly Indians known to be in the jungle. But only a few of the missing Americans have been found. All but military planes were forbidden to land when the government of Guyana declared a health emergency and quarantined the area surrounding Jonestown.
If the information from the Guyanese government is correct, that after 4 days in the sun, there is disease spreading from the corpses, then the time is now very limited for removing the dead. The horrifying task of the mortuary teams is already almost unimaginable.
At an airfield about 20 miles from the death scene, U.S. Army support units have set up a temporary base. From here, the grim military operation has several steps. First, the corpses have to be sealed in body bags. Then by helicopter out of the remote commune to Georgetown, the only airport big enough for the big C-141 Air Force transports to land. It will take 2 days for all the bodies to be recovered and flown to the U.S. A crowd gathered at the Georgetown Magistrates Court as one surviving member of the People's Temple, 32-year-old Larry Layton, was formally charged with the murders of Congressman Leo Ryan and 4 other Americans. 2 other suspects are in custody. Layton is accused of starting the bloody shootout that preceded the mass deaths of Jim Jones and his followers. John Sheehan, CBS News, Georgetown,
The Jonestown story took another quantum leap in horror today. The known death toll almost doubled to 775 as American troops found hundreds more decomposing bodies. They were piled underneath those that had been counted previously. Thus, the final toll is expected to be around 800. That would account for almost all of the population of the Reverend Jim Jones commune. Jones himself has been confirmed dead by FBI experts in Delaware who identified his body. Meanwhile, a survivor gave the first detailed account of the mass poisonings that Jones ordered and presided over last weekend. David Dick reports from Georgetown, Guyana.
The gruesome job of gathering up the last of the bodies was moving methodically. Authorities insisted for days that the number of the dead was 409. But there was a discrepancy that would not go away. In the beginning, 803 passports had been found. Today, the recovery teams discovered hundreds more bodies and admitted they had made a big mistake.
The original count of persons found dead at the Jonestown site has been found to be seriously in error. It now appears there may be as many as 780 bodies total found at the site. They were found simply buried under other bodies. There were larger adults that were grouped together, and under their bodies were found the bodies of smaller adults and children.
The first eyewitness account of the Jonestown murders and suicides came today from 36-year-old Odell Rhodes, who described himself as a former drug addict from Detroit. He said he witnessed many of the deaths, including the first one.
Well, the first person that went up was a young mother. I'd say she was about 27 or so. She had a small baby. And I'd say the baby was approximately 1.5, something like that. She walked up and she administered to her own baby, and then she took her home. And then she went over into a field and sat down, and that's, it was hard to believe. I could understand older people maybe, but I couldn't understand these young people just doing that. Parents were talking to their children and telling them whatever they were telling them, and a lot of the children were crying. And he was telling them not to tell the children that they were dying, not to tell them it was painful. He was telling people it wasn't painful and that, people had to die with dignity.
Odell Rhodes said he escaped by convincing security guards that he was going for more medical equipment.
I went into Kaituma and I went to a lighted building in Kaituma that is actually a PNC office. And there was a constable there, a couple constables and people standing around outside. And I went up and I, begged them to help to get people out to Jonestown. And there was nothing they could do at the time.
After the first of the bodies had been discovered, U.S. officials here began urging relatives not to come to Guyana, that there was nothing that could be done. That warning did not come in time for 39-year-old Claire Gennaro of Redwood Valley, California. She arrived in Georgetown Saturday night to join her husband and 2 teenage children who had preceded her to Jonestown. She believes her husband is alive, that he was on a boat that got away and later was picked up by Guyanese police. But she fears her children are among the dead.
Please, American people, help us. Please, help us down here. We are isolated. The American embassy does shit. The Guyanese government, they're tossing it back and forth, and we got people out there. We got maybe a chance of some of us being alive out there in the jungle. Please get some help down here. Go to the State Department, write President Carter. Please do whatever you can.
Today's startling announcement that there had been a mistake confirmed the worst fears of relatives who had kept asking, where are all those unaccounted for? Tonight, that final accounting has begun. David Dick, CBS News, Georgetown, Guyana.
News seemed to shatter the small group of Jones followers who were still trying to keep the faith that is People's Temple in San Francisco. Harold Dow reports.
Until today, all the remaining members of the church here said they'd try to keep the movement alive. But with word of hundreds more dead, some have changed their minds.
My family is possibly dead, and we know some for sure their families here are dead. But Jim Jones was totally wrong. So in my opinion, People's Temple is dead because the ideals it stood for can no longer stand. You've got, in a sense, you've got death riding over your head.
Based on the commitment that you see here of people who have suffered tremendous loss, but still stand for what we believe is right, and we'll continue to stand, whether it's together or whether we go separate ways. We can't say at this time.
And Charles Gary, the lawyer representing the People's Temple, said his colleague, Mark Lane, knew in advance of Congressman Ryan's trip that there was potential danger at Jonestown. But Gary said Lane did not disclose the information until after the attack at the airstrip.
Well, he knew, he said, that he'd been told a short while before this, about a week or 10 days before, without any corroboration, that there was drills going on for suicide packs. He knew that. He knew that there were people being drugged, and he knew that there were guns there. I did not know that there were guns there.
Meanwhile, at the People's Temple, members spent most of the day compiling a list of names in an effort to help the State Department identify the dead. Gary said the church would try to have some of the dead brought to California for burials, but the San Francisco church, he says, has almost no money. Harold Dow, CBS News, San Francisco.
Bodies of more than 250 of the Jonestown victims are now at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. More are on the way. Lem Tucker reports.
100 volunteers, along with the regular mortuary staff, are working 24 hours a day, processing the dead from Jonestown, and since none of the bodies has yet been released, storage is now a problem. Refrigerator trucks are serving as temporary morgues, more are being rented. And as fast as the aluminum boxes are emptied, they are sterilized. And now some will have to be shipped back to Guyana to be reused. These men had thought they would be free of this awful chore sometime tomorrow. So far, only one of the bodies has been positively identified. That was Jim Jones, founder of the People's Temple. 18 FBI fingerprint experts are now here. Additional pathologists arrive tomorrow, all hoping to speed up the process. But the job is an extremely difficult one.
Now, this is a very tedious process. Particularly when you lack the documentation that many of these bodies lack. You're starting from zero in the identification process. It's not like going to a vehicle accident and finding 3 bodies laying on the road and the guy's got a wallet with his driver's license with a photo on it.
The additional bodies mean the processing and identification phase, which the mortuary had hoped to complete in 10 days, will now take at least 3 weeks. And then there will be another problem, waiting for all the identified bodies to be claimed. And since so far officials here have only heard from about 36 families, they feel that maybe a number of the bodies will go unclaimed, even though positively identified. If so, after a still yet to be determined period of time, they, along with the unidentified, will be buried somewhere in the local area with the U.S. government bearing all costs. Lem Tucker, CBS News, Dover Air Force Base.
Good evening.
Delaware.
The news from Guyana is even worse than we thought yesterday. All of the bodies that have been sighted have now been airlifted out, but in still another almost unbelievable turn of events, another 135 bodies were found today, and authorities now believe the final death count will be about 910 people. Persistent question, of course, is why? Why does a person give up his goods, his freedom, even his mind, to the whims of another? There may be no satisfactory answer, but Mrs. Kathleen Griffin of Herndon, Virginia, sought one today in a conversation with our Jim McManus. Mrs. Griffin had 9 relatives in Guyana.
Their father died in 1960 and their mother in 1964, and it was at the time when they needed parents and needed a mother-father, and they joined, I think, because they felt the sense of loss of their parents and wanting to keep the family together, and I think the temple offered them this closeness, family togetherness, mother-father image, everything that a family should be. Now, they have been in the movement for 10 years. Now, 10 years is a long time to indoctrinate a person. And who can say what would happen to your mind in those 10 years? Because they weren't out of the presence of those people at all. For those 10 years, they lived in Ukiah with them. They lived in a house. They all lived together. When they started, it was a good thing to them. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't murder. They didn't cheat. They didn't rob. They were good people. They just were misled.
Are you saying that there are now organizations who really, in effect, prey upon some of the tensions and anxieties and strains in our society?
I think on the children, yes.
Does it worry you?
Yes, it does. It really does. I've got 6 children. I only have 2 left at home. And I thank the Lord every day. So far, they've turned out all right, because they could have gone the other way.
In this country, until a week ago, little was known about Guyana, the country where it all happened, and virtually nothing was known about Jonestown, the specific place where it happened. A look at Jonestown today by John Sheehan.
Jim Jones. The American Army and Air Force are packing up and closing their temporary bases. The operation of retrieving the dead from the remote jungle settlement is over. The last American transport helicopter has left Jonestown. For 4 days, they shuttled back and forth, removing the dead. The deserted settlement is now shunned by the Indians of the region, who say the scene of the mass death is branded with a fearful taboo. Hypodermic needles were said to have been used on small children and a few adults. But most of the victims seem to have drunk from cups which still contain the remnants of the deadly mixture of potassium cyanide. The commander of the American military operation explained one of the mysteries of the bizarre events of Jonestown, why the U.S. mortuary squads missed so many bodies the first time they counted them.
From what I observed, the people, when they committed suicide, stood in nice, neat little circles, children in front of them, and as they died, they folded into the interior of the circle, and there were mounds of people. And as we pulled off the surface cover, we found more and more people under the mounds. Apparently, it appeared as though there were children in front of the parents. As they went over, then, of course, the parents went on top of them.
The physical evidence found by U.S. forces at Jonestown did not support speculation that poison was administered by force to many, or that the bodies were stacked after unwilling victims were dead. Contrary to rumor, no blankets were found between the layers of bodies. A few, such as cult leader Jim Jones, had been shot, but survivors say he held his disciples spellbound, and for most, the instrument of death was a paper cup. The poison had been stocked for many months in the well-appointed, well-staffed clinic. The deserted camp holds ample evidence of indoctrination that bordered on brainwashing, as Jones prepared his followers for what he said was the planned migration to the Soviet Union. The government of Guyana says the commune will be closed and that no more foreign religious groups will be given land. And though the premises have been searched and repeatedly looted, there are still some echoes of the people who came here looking for a joyful and more meaningful life for themselves and their children. John Sheehan, CBS News, Georgetown, Guyana.
The echoes of the mass murders and suicides at Jonestown in Guyana last November continue to sound across the country. In tapes broadcast today by NBC News, a voice identified as that of the Reverend James Jones exhorts his followers to kill themselves. And then referring to the murder of Congressman Leo Ryan, the voice says, "I don't know who fired the shot, but as far as I'm concerned, I killed him." Another death was added to the People's Temple toll last night. Bernard Goldberg reports.
Mike Prokes was one of Jim Jones' closest aides. At a news conference last night in Modesto, California, he again defended the cult. Then he walked into an adjoining room and shot himself through the head. He left a suicide note which said he wanted to die, as he put it, for the same just reasons as those who died in Jonestown. He was 31, the latest victim of the People's Temple tragedy. Across the country, at the Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, the bodies of 554 other victims of that tragedy still remain unclaimed, nearly 4 months after their deaths. So many are unclaimed because so many relatives in San Francisco cannot afford to bring them home for burial. This is a predominantly poor, predominantly black neighborhood where Jim Jones found his followers. A judge is considering a plan to have the bodies returned by a caravan of trucks to relatives here, the cost to be taken from People's Temple assets. Fred Lewis lost his wife, his sister, and his 7 children at Jonestown. He lost 27 relatives in all. So far, he has brought only 4 of them home for burial.
Well, that has broke me, you know. We don't have any money now, you know, and we're still trying to get the other bodies back. I feel like the United States abandoned these people.
And counselors say that until the bodies are returned from Delaware for final burial, the survivors of the temple and the relatives of those who died in Jonestown cannot begin to put the nightmare behind them.
We have a movement which taught people that it was right and proper to commit suicide for the sake of the cause. So the longer it takes for these events to get wrapped up, the greater the possibility that some of the survivors will commit suicide.
$10 sold $7.50, buyer number 19.
And today, the doors of the old brick People's Temple were open for an auction in order to raise money to help pay off the numerous claims against the temple. Everything went on the block. Buses, drums filled with food destined for Jonestown, the church piano, the organ. The temple itself sold for $300,000. A Korean American made the high bid and says he plans to convert the temple into a Protestant church. Fred Lewis says he won't go anywhere near the building. He spends much of his time walking and wondering.
I'm thinking and hoping that maybe 1 or 2 of my kids are still alive and they might call. This is my hope. This is my belief.
Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, San Francisco.
2 years ago this week, the mass murder-suicide at Jonestown in Guyana shocked the world. One of its central figures is back in the United States today to face charges of conspiracy in the incident that set the tragedy in motion, the murder of Congressman Leo Ryan. Steve Young reports.
After spending the last 2 years in jail in steamy Guyana, Larry Layton returned to the United States last night coatless, surrounded by federal marshals at Kennedy Airport in New York.
Mr. Layton, did you shoot Congressman Ryan?
Layton was tried and cleared by a Guyanese court of charges involving the wounding of 2 people in an ambush at a dusty airstrip in Port Kaituma, several miles from the People's Temple jungle settlement. In this country, a federal grand jury in San Francisco last month handed up a 4-count indictment. Of those accused, he is the sole survivor. The indictment charges Layton and other People's Temple members now dead of conspiring to kill Congressman Leo Ryan, conspiring to kill the Deputy Chief of Mission for the United States in Guyana, returning to Jonestown to conduct and supervise the executions and suicides of members of the People's Temple. Layton's attorney in New York was William Kunstler, who represented many political radicals in the 1960s. The brief 14-minute appearance today was not an arraignment but a removal proceeding, permitting authorities to transfer Layton to California. He stood quietly, his arms folded behind his back, then signed the necessary document, exchanged a few words with Kunstler, but otherwise said nothing. The marshals who brought Layton back from Guyana were in the car with him for the flight to the West Coast. Layton's lawyer reserved the right to challenge the constitutionality of the indictment and the process through which Layton was brought back to the United States. He is expected to be arraigned in San Francisco Monday. Steve Young, CBS News, at Federal Court in Brooklyn.
In a San Francisco courtroom tomorrow, there will be more echoes of Jonestown, the People's Temple, and the deaths of more than 900 people. It's the continuing trial of Larry Layton, charged with plotting the murders of a group that went to Guyana to investigate the cult nearly 3 years ago. Gary Shepard reports tonight on the long journey from the law of the jungle in Guyana to the law of the United States.
It was last November that Larry Layton was returned to the United States from Guyana to stand trial for conspiracy to murder Congressman Leo Ryan and U.S. diplomat Richard Dwyer at an airstrip a few miles from the People's Temple commune at Jonestown nearly 3 years ago. Layton is the only person to be tried in an American courtroom on charges relating to the Jonestown affair. And as the proceedings got underway here at federal court in San Francisco, for many it was like turning the clock back to November 1978, to a series of events in a remote South American jungle that shocked the world. The mass suicide of more than 900 followers of the Reverend Jim Jones only a few hours after Congressman Ryan and 4 others were murdered as they were attempting to leave the Jonestown settlement. Harold Cordell, one of the cult members who lived in Jonestown, painted a graphic picture of what conditions there were like. A dozen people crowded into a small cabin the size of a living room, meals of rice and water, 12 hours a day of hard labor in the fields, then long meetings into the night conducted by Jones. Journalist Ronald Javers, at the time a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who accompanied Ryan to Guyana, recalled that as the Ryan party was leaving Jonestown, Larry Layton jumped on the truck at the last minute, claiming he too was getting out. Javers testified that when Layton got aboard, other defecting cult members became noticeably agitated and very frightened and cowered at the other end of the truck. Javers then recounted in gripping detail the rising tension at the airstrip, Layton, wearing a dark poncho, being checked for firearms by Leo Ryan, the arrival of a flatbed truck, and Jones' followers opening fire on the crowd. Bob Brown, the NBC News cameraman who took these pictures, saying to Javers, "Oh boy, this is it." Brown hit, falling to the ground with his camera, cursing that he was shot and hurt. Then one of the gunmen walking up to Brown and blowing the side of his head off. Jackie Spear, who was wounded but survived, recalling how she tried to stem the flow of blood from Ryan's neck as she herself lay on the ground bleeding. During all this testimony, Larry Layton sitting transfixed at the defense table, listening intently. Defense attorneys argue the government simply does not have enough evidence to convict Larry Layton of murder conspiracy, that although he may have attempted to kill 2 defecting cult members at the airstrip, as one witness testified, the plot to kill Ryan was something entirely separate and that he was not connected with it in any way.
The trial is expected to last for 2 or 3 months, and if Layton is convicted, he would face a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Gary Shepard, CBS News.
And still another bizarre development on the Guyana story. The former television reporter who became a spokesman for the Reverend Jim Jones in his People's Temple called a news conference last night in Modesto, California, delivered an impassioned defense of the cult, then left the room and killed himself. David Browning reports.
Mike Prokes had been a PR man for People's Temple and a top advisor to Jim Jones. He survived the bloodbath at Jonestown and was held under lengthy house arrest by Guyanese authorities. Finally released, he returned to California, where, he told a friend, he was maintaining, surviving, getting himself together. Last night, Prokes held a news conference in a motel room in Modesto, California. He complained that the U.S. State Department and the CIA provoked what happened at Jonestown because, he said, they didn't like people finding freedom in another land. The people of Jonestown, he said, saw death as the only way out.
It was a moral act of courage and commitment to their beliefs. They were saying, we're not going to take any more. We'll die by our own hand rather than be destroyed or broken up by the long arm of the oppressor. Maybe it sounds trite, but they were saying basically the same thing as Patrick Henry said, give us our liberty or we will die.
They turned out to be the final words and moments of a troubled man. Because when the news conference ended, Mike Prokes walked to an adjoining room and put a bullet through his head. Bystanders and paramedics tried frantically to save him, and they found a note in which he said he wanted to die, in his words, for the same just reasons as those in Jonestown. 3 hours later, Mike Prokes, 31, died in the hospital. David Browning, CBS News, San Francisco.
Members who escaped the suicidal carnage of Jonestown are expected to begin returning to the United States tomorrow. The State Department said the first 7 would arrive at Charlestown, South Carolina. FBI agents will be there to question them about the mass suicides and killings. In Guyana, Prime Minister Forbes Burnham was meeting with his cabinet to determine what will happen to the 3,000 acres of jungle that was Jonestown. Our David Dick went there to look at all that is left.
Jim Jones led his people here and called it Jonestown. Even though it was called the People's Temple Settlement, suggesting a religious experience, there was no church, only a pavilion, and in recent months, not even church services. Jim Jones was the only deity in Jonestown. Jones lived on the edge of the settlement. He frequently said he was a sick man who needed special oxygen, health foods, and drugs. In the middle of the night, Dad would tell the community over a loudspeaker that he was having trouble sleeping. This is all that's left of the house where Bishop Jim Jones lived. None of the members of the cult dared call him Jim. He forced them to call him Dad, forced them to write letters. Dear Dad, I don't know how to write a letter examining my faults. I've tried before, and it always sounds fraudulent. That's what I think I am, a big fraud. Dear Dad, please help me to write this to you. Hope you'll get it since you don't get the notes I sent. Only you know what's going on with me. After hearing you speak on comparing oneself with racist realities, I felt that I should be shot. Self-analysis. I see myself as problem to all the people, sometimes like when I get on the floor and take up the people's time and I have a short temper. Yes, Dad, I did spend money that I could have put in the cause, but not very much since I knew you. Before I learned about you, I spent lots of money buying things I didn't need. July 1978, to the dearest Dad in the world. I'm trying to tell you some of my lifestyle the best I can. I know that I have wasted lots of money before I knowed you, some since I met you. For lots of things I could have done without, so I felt bad about it. Dear Dad, this is from a person 78 years old. I think it is the best cause I have been in, and I intend to stay with it to the end. Yesterday, authorities of Guyana nailed shut the door to Jim Jones' house and sealed the People's Temple settlement. Even if Jonestown is swallowed up by the jungle, this place will always mean mass suicide. David Dick, CBS News, Jonestown, Guyana.
Good evening. In the immediate aftermath of the suicidal carnage of Jonestown, there were reports that the religious cult had a hit squad and that prominent officials were its targets. It now appears those reports are true. Bernard Goldberg in San Francisco has the story.
Federal law enforcement officials have begun warning prominent Californians that they apparently were marked for death by members of the People's Temple. Sources say defectors from the cult have told them that public figures and others were listed as targets. Among the targets, former President Richard Nixon, former California Governor Ronald Reagan, reporters from the San Francisco Examiner who wrote critically of Jones People's Temple, and Grace Stone, a former high-ranking member of the People's Temple who defected, says she attended meetings in California to discuss murder, and that Temple members were ordered by Jones to sign statements saying they were prepared to kill if called upon.
Everybody had to make up different statements, and it was basically, I want to kill the President of the United States. You know, I don't think we named a specific president at the time, and I think it was left open. And then we signed it, and I think it was left undated.
California Assemblyman Willie Brown has also been warned that he was a possible target. Brown, in the past, had spoken favorably of the People's Temple.
The Justice Department advised me that they had, in fact, confirmed the existence of a list and that they considered it serious enough to advise all the people contained on that list, and that they were taking this matter very serious and that they consider it to be dangerous.
Federal sources tell CBS News they do not know why prominent public officials, such as former President Nixon, were named as targets. They also say that People's Temple attorney Mark Lane and a former high-ranking member of the temple met today near San Francisco with the U.S. Attorney to discuss immunity for the former church member in exchange for testimony concerning the murder of Congressman Leo Ryan. And one high-ranking federal law officer said there is concern that among the survivors now returning from Guyana to the United States are some potentially dangerous people. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, San Francisco.
And in Washington, the FBI confirmed that it had been told that members of the People's Temple discussed the assassinations of, quote, prominent individuals. More survivors of Jonestown left Guyana today for New York, and this time no chances were being taken. Armed federal marshals accompanied them on the flight. David Dick reports from Georgetown.
16 men and 1 woman of the People's Temple checked out of their hotel in downtown Georgetown 4 hours before the scheduled departure of their flight to the United States. A U.S. Embassy official urged them to hurry. 15 other People's Temple members have not received permission to leave or are staying voluntarily. Stephen, the natural son of Jim Jones, embraced Tim, an adopted son, who along with another adopted son left today. Stephen and Tim were both away from Jonestown when the murders and suicides occurred. Tim is understood to have been a member of Jim Jones' security force, and some see Stephen as a potential successor to his father in temple affairs.
How do you react to these reports that are appearing now about the connections that your father had with the Guyanese government?
After what I've seen, I don't doubt anything, but I wasn't aware of it.
As you look back at it, can you see any connections, any evidence?
The only connections, I thought everything was like legitimate, you know. I thought that we had leased some land, you know, to try to build something, try to help the country, and I wasn't aware, you know. I'm sure that there were little deals on the side or something, but I wasn't aware of anything.
And what about connections with the U.S. Embassy here? Were you able to see any of that?
They came out and visited and made sure everybody was okay, and that's all I knew about.
A Guyanese government-controlled newspaper this morning headlined a denial of the reports linking the People's Temple to key Guyanese officials. But the December issue of a regional newspaper accused both Guyanese and U.S. authorities of criminal negligence. U.S. Embassy officials here refused to discuss the allegations. 6 U.S. sky marshals checked in at the Georgetown airport this morning. They refused all comment. They began a methodical, bag-by-bag, person-by-person search of all People's Temple members going on Pan Am Flight 228. A pair of scissors and some electrical wiring were confiscated. The 17 People's Temple members were escorted to the plane by the sky marshals, and Flight 228 departed for New York 1 hour late. David Dick, CBS News, Georgetown, Guyana.
They have begun making a new movie in Mexico, a movie entitled Guyana, the Crime of the Century, based, of course, on last November's mass murders and suicides at Jonestown. The movie's been budgeted at almost $2.5 million. As distasteful as that may be, it is not the only project aimed at making money out of what happened at Jonestown. Steve Young has a report this morning on another project that uses what is believed to be Jim Jones' own voice. We should warn you that some of what's in this report is not pleasant listening.
Don't be afraid to die. If these people land out here, they'll torture some of our children here. They'll torture our people. They'll torture our seniors. We cannot have this. Are you going to separate yourself from whoever shot the congressman? I don't know who shot him.
For weeks, the U.S. and Guyanese governments have withheld a tape recording which investigators think was made as Jim Jones exhorted his followers to commit what he called revolutionary suicide. A copy of that tape recording was given to Bo Buchanan of a New York firm called the International Home Video Club. Apparently, his source was a Guyanese who left the country with the tape and who has relatives back in Guyana who might be in danger if his name were made public. Buchanan held a news conference yesterday to announce he intends to sell the recording to the public at $9.95 a copy.
I think it's a very valuable tape. I mean, I think it's valuable that people hear this. There's something in hearing it, more than just reading it, where you can sense the horror.
He justified the venture as a way for the public to better understand what happened in order to avoid another Jonestown. But Buchanan frankly admitted that his main goal is to make money, the same way he makes money selling movies on video cassettes, movies which range from art films to pornography.
Why do you have the right to sell this tape?
I've got it. It's like, what gives somebody the right to own land? If you get there first and you stick your flag in it, it's yours.
It was said by the greatest prophet from time immemorial, "No man takes my life from me, I lay my life down."
Several reporters pointedly asked about the commercial exploitation of the deaths of hundreds of people. But still, there was an eerie fascination with the tape recording, which runs on for 43 minutes. Resistance by some, at first, to Jones' call for everyone to swallow the cyanide-poisoned drink. Screams of children, the sound of organ music. Little resistance at the end.
I don't care how many screams you hear, I don't care how many anguished cries. Death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days
Steve Young, CBS News, New York.
It's 100% pure pain reliever. Bayer adds nothing because you don't need anything else. And millions use Bayer with no stomach upset. All you need is Bayer aspirin. If you need more than Bayer, see your doctor.
All I need is Bayer.
A House subcommittee late today refused to approve funds for President Carter's draft registration plan. Opponents of the plan hailed the subcommittee's action as a serious setback for the program, but administration officials predicted that the full Appropriations Committee will approve the president's plan later. Al and Jeannie Mills were members of the People's Temple cult who turned against the Reverend Jim Jones. That was before the ritualistic deaths of more than 900 cult members in Guyana in November 1978. Afterward, the Mills said they feared vengeance. Last night, someone killed them in their Berkeley, California home. Barry Peterson reports.
The bodies were found about 10 p.m. Authorities said there were no signs of forced entry, so the Mills may have known their killer. Investigators worked through the day hunting for clues, saying they knew of no motives. The youngest son, Eddie, was watching television in another part of the house when a relative discovered the bodies. He told police he saw and heard nothing. Neighbors were shocked at the news.
I just turned it on the radio this morning and I had to see if it was true.
Did you know them very well? Authorities say it's too soon to speculate.
At this point, we have absolutely no information which would lend any connection to the Mills' prior involvement with the People's Temple and their slaying last night.
Can you discount it, at this point?
I don't think you can discount anything other, but it's pure conjecture.
Al and Jeannie Mills left the church in 1975 and became among the most vocal of People's Temple defectors. They established the Human Freedom Center in Berkeley, a haven for others who might want to defect. Last year, Jeannie Mills published a book about her 6 years as a church member, warning of so-called hit squads set up by the Reverend Jim Jones. And during a CBS News interview, she said she feared she and others were targeted for death.
As the threats toward people's lives became increased, I got the feeling that possibly we would all be killed, all the survivors from People's Temple would be killed, and that all the records would be destroyed. So I wanted to have this record someplace where it could not be destroyed, where the temple couldn't come in and burn it.
But today, the attorney who once represented the temple was disbelieving.
I would be horribly surprised if any temple member were involved.
Still, until it's proved this was not the work of a so-called hit squad, other defectors may wonder and perhaps fear that this is just the beginning of the retribution the Reverend Jim Jones promised. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Berkeley.
Under very tight security, hundreds of thousands of Rhodesian blacks began 3 days voting today in parliamentary elections that will lead to a new black-governed nation of Zimbabwe. 9 parties are competing for the 80 black seats in the 100-member parliament. The other seats will be filled by whites who voted earlier this month. There were 135 persons aboard the China Airlines 707 when it caught fire and exploded during a landing at Manila. But miraculously, after the fire, only 3 were missing, and airline officials said there was a good chance they too were alive. The pilot said the plane went into a steep dive during the approach, and he could not regain control. A new complication has developed for gravely ill Yugoslav President Tito.
Will try to stop leakage of spinal fluid from Brady's skull in an operation described as elective rather than imperative. It was a story that seemed without historic parallel. The mass murders and suicides of more than 900 followers of the People's Temple in Guyana, November 1978. It seems unlikely the world will ever completely understand what happened. But in a San Francisco courtroom today, a trial got underway that may produce some of the answers. Gary Shepard was there.
Larry Layton, now 35 years old, watched intently this morning as the prosecution played 2 hours of videotape of Congressman Leo Ryan's trip to the People's Temple commune in Jonestown nearly 3 years ago. Videotape that included this sequence leading up to the murder of Ryan and 4 others as the congressman, in the center wearing a white shirt, was preparing to board a plane to leave. Among those who died in the hail of gunfire was NBC News cameraman Bob Brown, who took these pictures. Federal Judge Robert Peckham, who was presiding at Layton's trial, ruled that most of the videotape, including the entire murder sequence, was indeed admissible as evidence, and this afternoon the trial got underway with opening arguments. Layton, who served as one of the top aides to the Reverend Jim Jones, is accused of conspiring to murder both Congressman Ryan and U.S. diplomat Richard Dwyer, who survived the ambush. Federal law allows prosecution for crimes committed outside the United States in this instance. Layton was tried in Guyana in May of 1980 for his involvement in the murder of 2 cult members at the airstrip, but was acquitted of all charges. Today, defense attorney Tony Tamburello said his client is innocent.
We feel Larry Layton is no different than any of the 914 victims that died in Jonestown. It's the prosecution's burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was involved in a conspiracy. We intend to show that the government has failed to prove it, and we intend to show that he did not agree to kill Congressman Ryan.
Layton's trial is expected to last 2 to 3 months, and if he's ultimately convicted, he faces a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Gary Shepard, CBS News, San Francisco.
Fruit fly worries have Japan threatening a quarantine of California imports. U.S. government officials spent the day trying to get at least a modification of any such quarantine. They seek to have it limited to fruits known to be infested. Because of the fruit fly, California Governor Jerry Brown finds himself
Life itself would be impossible. With chemicals, Monsanto is making life a lot more livable.
It was 3 months ago that Representative Leo Ryan and 4 other persons were killed at a remote jungle airstrip in Guyana, triggering the nightmare of Jonestown. The man accused of the airstrip murders entered a surprise plea today of not guilty. David Dick reports from Georgetown, Guyana.
When Larry Layton was led along the upper porch of Guyana's Supreme Court building, he looked gaunt, his face drawn. His guards took him to the prisoner's box in the courtroom, and there he sat, waiting for his trial to begin. But the attorneys for his defense were still busy maneuvering. There were hushed conferences with Layton, and after a 45-minute delay, a decision was made for Layton to reverse what he had been expected to do. He now would plead not guilty to all charges. Chief Defense Attorney Rex McKay then asked for a postponement to permit him time to bring psychiatric witnesses from the United States. The Chief Justice granted an adjournment until February 28th. It may never be known with certainty what transpired in the last-minute bargaining, but the strong impression is it involved a reduction of the life sentence to a lesser number of years, possibly as few as 5. When no agreement could be reached, the defense then decided it might have nothing to lose and everything to gain by changing to a plea of not guilty on all charges. But as Larry Layton was taken away in an open truck to his jail cell, it also reopened the possibility that if the prosecution does prove its original murder charge, Layton might still go to the gallows. David Dick, CBS News, Georgetown, Guyana.
Big Labor, modifying its position slightly, today endorsed President Carter's wage insurance program, but with some reluctance. The AFL-CIO Executive Council, however, remained opposed to other features at the Carter anti-inflation plan, such as cutbacks in the budgets of social programs and wage price guidelines.
The only lotion that keeps you Calgon soft after your bath. New Calgon After Bath Lotion for silky, soft skin all day. New Calgon After Bath Lotion makes Calgon softness last all day.
It was 10 years ago today. A bizarre story of murder and mass suicide unfolding at Jonestown, Guyana. Congressman Leo Ryan went there to investigate the People's Temple cult, and something went horribly wrong a short time later. Ryan and 4 others were murdered as they tried to leave Guyana. Hours later, Jim Jones gave out the order that his followers were to commit suicide. Hundreds drank a cyanide-laced punch. Those who fought the order were killed. And when the poisoning and shooting stopped, 913 people were dead, many of them children. Joining us this morning from Montreal, the daughter of the late Congressman Leo Ryan, Patricia Ryan. Good morning, Patricia.
Good morning.
Why did your father go down to Jonestown? Did some of his constituents warn him of the dangers, or they were actually people in Guyana were the constituents themselves, weren't they?
Yeah, he was approached by several constituents, parents of kids who had sort of disappeared and ended up in Jonestown. And they had tried to get the attention of other officials for some time, and they finally came in desperation to my father.
What did your father know of cults at the time?
He didn't know much, but he probably knew more than the average congressman at the time. He happened at that time to have a nephew who was involved in a cult and had been missing for several years himself.
And then less than 2 years after your father died, I believe, your older sister Shannon was actually recruited by a cult.
That's right.
I find that sometimes...
Just goes to show if it can happen to somebody in my family, it can happen to almost anybody.
Well, how did it happen to Shannon? And was it the Bhagwan, Sri Rajneesh?
It was
the group
Bhagwan.
Up in Portland, Oregon?
Right, right. The guy with 91 Rolls Royces. I wish I knew how it happened to her. I personally think that she may have been targeted and recruited. She would probably disagree with me, but as soon as she joined the organization, they used her to parade around the news stories, TV shows to publicize Rajneesh and to use the irony of her joining Rajneesh to show that they weren't so bad.
10 years after your father's death, do you think there are more cults now than there were then?
That's what the experts say.
There are estimates between 2,500 and 5,000 cults in this country alone.
That's right, and if the phone calls to the National Occult Awareness Office every day are any indication, they never stop ringing. So there are lots of people out there who are being very, very hurt by this phenomenon. Family members and ex-members themselves.
Patricia, who's most vulnerable to cult recruitment?
Well, the cults that actively recruit tend to go after and be able to recognize people who may be in transition, who may be missing something in their lives, or maybe have broken up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, have lost a family member, or are generally lonely. But I think in reality, almost anybody is vulnerable. If you sign up for a self-awareness course, you could very easily be taken in by a group leader who decides to use his powers to his benefit. So you really have to beware, and everybody has to beware.
But Patricia, do you think it's a free choice, or are people targeted?
Both. Well, I think people think that often they think they freely choose to join an organization, but one of the signs of a destructive cult is that they don't often tell you up front what you're getting involved in. If they told you up front what you were going to be involved in a month from that first day, you would never join.
Patricia, do you think Jonestown could happen again?
I don't know whether something exactly like Jonestown could happen, but I know that the possibility is always there because there are hundreds and probably thousands of leaders out there who have enough control over their followers' minds that if they decided to ask them to commit the ultimate sacrifice, they would do it.
Patricia Ryan, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
It's 17 minutes before the hour. Harry?
And still ahead, the civil rights movement in the Kennedy years.